is based on a true story about a man called Alan Conway, who pretended to be Stanley Kubrick in the early 1990s in London, and got away with some rather astonishing feats, if you will.
So on action, please forgive me.
Stanley said, well, listen, you know, find out what you can about this guy.
He was a sort of little Jewish guy from Harrow Wealdstone, who I wouldn't particularly have assessed to be gay when I saw him.
And I produced a big file, you know, an ongoing file for Stanley about, you know, what he was doing, what he was up to. And, you know, I kept Stanley abreast on a day-to-day basis. I first heard about Alan Conway in the early 1990s. I got a phone call from Pinewood Studios, from Warner Brothers down there, asking me to relay a message to Stanley Kubrick from a friend of his, a friend of Stanley's who lived in Brighton. And Stanley said, I've never heard of the guy. I'll phone him up and find out what he wants. So I phoned up the guy, and the guy said, well, I'm a very, very close friend of Stanley Kubrick's. I've been round to his house. I said, where is this house? And he said, oh, in Wealdstone, you know, Harrow, northwest London. And I thought, there's something funny going on here.
You know,
3001 will do for 2001 what 2001 did for when that was.
If Stanley was over there as you know, I mean, Mr. Research, Alan Conway was over there as Mr. Unresearch, because Conway knew next to nothing about Stanley's films.
I started gushing after a bit of lunch. I said, Stanley, Full Metal Jacket, it was absolutely fantastic. I said, I can't believe it. I said, first of all, I think it was just great the way you got rid of that actor and used the real drill sergeant instead. Fucking genius. Oh, so sensational. And that opening shot where it comes all the way down the line and he said, you're a steer or a career, all that stuff, fantastic. Not one cut, not one edit, fantastic. How many takes did that take? And he looked me in the eyes and he said, a lot. I was, a lot. Totally taken in.
Made a couple of TV programs about him, which were pretty funny. And there were several articles written about him. I mean, not a ton. There was quite a long article in Vanity Fair, and Frank Rich wrote a piece, and etc. All of which I read, and a little bit in the English press also.
And I've seen stuff of Alan Conway, like we all have, and Michael has, and John has, of recordings and TV things, after he was exposed.
It was seriously
a nice end frame. Acceptable end frame. Stanley would have wanted it just a fraction more. No, on the side, just a touch more to the right. But it was perfect. I loved it. Somebody would have had this would have been a 2-day job with Stanley. This shot, a week to light and a week to shoot with Stanley, this shot.
Well, walking you through a Kubrick shot is
very nice.
A long time.
Really, really nice.
He spent a lot of time on the set and the lighting for each individual thing. So, I mean, we would spend hours and hours and hours getting that right before we even got round to rehearsing with the actors. And once he got the environment right, then he'd put the actors in it. I mean, you know, Stanley was in a position he could do that because obviously he'd made enough money to enable people him to back him on other movies. I mean, there's no way studios let you operate like that unless you've made money for them in the past.
Stanley thought very highly of Brian, and I think the Brian's record with Stanley speaks for itself. I mean, you wouldn't be invited back here if Stanley didn't think you could do the job. And to do 3 pictures for Stanley, I mean, as an AD, is quite some achievement. Many are called and few are chosen.
Stanley's assistant director on Barry Lyndon, also the assistant director on The Shining, and assistant director and co-producer on Eyes Wide Shut. So I did 3 movies with him over a period of 30 years, really. What's my funniest memory of Stanley? Well, he was a very big guy. Probably some of my funniest memories I wouldn't like to repeat on the air here.
4:10 on the...
It's the whole thing to do with, you know, sort of modern ideas of celebrity. You know, I mean, gee, you've touched the hem of celebrity. I met Stanley Kubrick, you know, some of that glitter's going to wear off of me. I mean, how glamorous, how wonderful.
I thought it was amusing that he could get away with it. I mean, it's staggering to me that he could actually go around London and people believe this. It just shows you that nobody really knew. A lot of people in those days didn't know what Stanley looked like.
But if you're going to be someone no one's really much seen, and many people are quite intimidated by the mystique of, well, it's pretty smart, really.
Eventually, he got pretty fed up with it, I think, with all the phone calls and letters and things that he used to get of abuse from people about this guy. And so did Christiana, his wife, because there were a lot of very nasty letters and phone calls, I think, that came out of all of this, with relationships with the young guys and different things like that. And I think, you know, a lot of people seem to think that Stanley Kubrick was running around, you know, procuring all these young kids and everything else.
What would Stanley have said about this film? I think he would...
I think Stanley Kubrick would sit there, probably in complete silence like this, not that I know, ever met him or anything, and be really amused by it.
He'd be delighted that he's posthumously getting his revenge. I think that's what he would say. I think he'd enjoy it. I mean, he'd be astonished that anybody can shoot a picture in 8 weeks, because that's one thing that Kubrick couldn't do, of course.
I was screen tested for The Shining, but he was then so shy already, I never met him. I remember I went to a school in North London, and they set up video equipment in the school gymnasium, and I was interviewed by a man who was getting questions from Mr. Kubrick, and he had a clipboard with a list of questions, and he was being, as it were, directed by Mr. Kubrick through a link, and Mr. Kubrick was in some other room.
I had an image of Stanley that was big. I pictured a big bear of a man, a lot of thick black hair, a strong man, Oliver Stone with even more hair. And I got ready and I could hear him coming. Stanley coming. And Q, and he came through the door. And I stood up and I had to drop my eyeline about a foot. I'd got it completely wrong. I mean, he was kind of sweet, cuddly little, he wasn't the big bear.
To the sort of great unwashed, he was a sort of mystical figure who didn't travel, who didn't take airplanes, who worked in secrecy, who just wasn't seen.
I would say that that Kubrick was a fine filmmaker, and that the mythology of Kubrick is an incredible fraud perpetrated by, you know, the mass media, marketing, and of course combined with real talent. But the near deification of Stanley Kubrick, I find a rather mesmerizing and mysterious case.
Stanley Kubrick, in the mind of many people, is a genius.
I knew Kubrick, of course. I mean, we all knew him. Oh, no, not only his work. Legend, yes, absolutely.
I like Stanley a lot. He's very amusing. Stanley would be one of your top 12 for dinner if you had to choose a dinner table. Because on his own, he was a tremendous raconteur and very, very dry sense of humor, particularly about people in the film industry. He had a tremendous feeling about them all, and very dry and funny and very witty. He could be very amusing. A very tough businessman, though. Could be lethally tough, Stanley, when he had to be.
Kieran? Yeah? Job for you.
Well, I actually sat 3 months in Ireland and never worked a day. Because Stanley every day would say, I may need you tomorrow. And I'd say, Stanley, can I go home for Christmas? I think I may need you.
It was never just a job working for for Stanley. I mean, it was a way of life. I mean, you know, you'd get phone calls at all times of the day or night. It was very demanding working for Stanley, but also, I mean, very rewarding.
Now here we are, you know, all these years later, doing a very modern, funny film, and Stanley would, I mean, I'm sure he's smiling down on us here. He would love it.
Stanley, are you paying attention? Because Tony Fruin's been taking care of you all these years, and now the house of cook has come into its own, and isn't it marvellous that we're here?
I've got so many stories packed into a very short amount of time. I don't know what to tell you.
Stanley hated being called Stan. Absolutely loathed it. And I loved it in the picture, putting that in, because, you know, if he'd have been watching it, he'd have really hated that. That would have really annoyed him. The only person I know who used to who could get away with calling him Stan was Jack. And Jack used to do that, I think, really just to tease him, because he knew he hated it so much. But nobody else, anybody else said that to Stanley, he would, you know, Stanley, not Stan. Yeah, he hated it. No, I like putting those things in, yeah. They sort of amuse me personally. I don't suppose they amuse anybody else.
Always refer to me as Stanley.
Mr. Jimmy. I mean, Jack refused to dump in his own time on The Shining. He would only dump in Stanley's time.
That shows what professionals some of us are.
Okay.
What Stanley and I did do, we often used to come up with titles for films that we thought should be made.
Whose title was it? Who came up with the title?
Tony.
Tony?
Well, I didn't like his original title, and then he came up with his original title.
Dr. Fickle and Mr. Jive, which I quite liked, and I'm still quite fond of.
Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Jive.
I used to keep a list of, in fact I've still got it, of sort of titles we came up with. Only Ministers of the Third Reich can use green ink. Stanley thought was a wonderful title. Leg Candy was another good title. Coffin Not Included. Stanley thought Sharp Shadow was a good title. Roof Goo was another one. I mean, we had a roofer in who was applying this awful viscous stuff to the roof. And Stanley said, "What's that?" And the guy said, "Roof Goo."
Then I needed some stationery. Like by the morning of the second day, it was time to kind of get going. Okay, I'd read it, kind of, you know. It was time to mark up the script. It was time to get going on making this movie. And I needed a few bits. I brought in my usual stuff, but I needed some specific bits. I needed a new file, and I needed some markers, and I needed a stapler and a hole punch or whatever. And I remember probably saying to Brian, maybe, I'll just pop out at lunch. I'll go down to High Street in St Albans and go to Smith's and buy myself some stuff. And maybe it was Brian, and Brian said, well, you want to check with Tony first. So I went home and saw Tony Fruin, who, as you know, our screenwriter, and said, "Tony, I just need to pop down to W.H. Smith's at lunch." "Oh," he said, "you don't need to do that. Stanley will take care of that for you." I beg your pardon? I was a new boy in the Kubrick enterprise of life. I beg your pardon? No, please, Tony, you don't need to travel. I just need to pop down to Smith's and get myself some stationery. And have you got a list? No, Tony, I don't have a list. You know, I just need a few bits and pieces. Please don't bother. I'll just, I'll pick up a sandwich and I'll be back in half an hour. No. You don't understand, Crispin. You need to go and see Stanley for this. And it was due late, so I went back to my office, and I was encouraged to ring Mr. Kubrick, who I called Stanley. I have to say, he told me to call him Stanley, so that was good. I loved that. "Hello, Stanley. Crispian. I just need, Tony's referred me to you. I need a little bit of stationery. And I understand, speaking incredibly nervously, like I'm talking to God about just needing a lever arch file and some index markers and some luminous pens to mark up the script and bit of paper, and could I have a paper clip maybe, a post-it note or two, and he said, well, come down to me. And so I went over to the house and knocked on his study door, and he came out, and we went along the corridor and down the hall and downstairs, and we went to the stationery office. Big room, Army Dexian shells, very kind of Second World War to 50s, and all the stationery that there's ever been on any one of his films available. And I'd had to draw up a list by then, and he said, what's on your list? I said, I need a hole punch, please. And so he went along and gave me a sort of 1953 hole punch. And could I have a stapler, please, Stanley? So, have a stapler. Give me a stapler. Lever arch file, and God knows what movies this stuff had been. I think the only new thing I got from him was a little pack of post-it notes. And I went off and I thought, I've just been issued my stationery by Stanley Kubrick. Is this right? Fabulous. Love it.
There will never be another Stanley Kubrick in the film world, certainly not in my era, and highly unlikely that the studios will allow it to happen in anybody in your era either. And I'm not so sure that there are too many people who'd want to spend a year shooting a movie either. I think younger people today, they want to get on, shoot the films, make another one and make another film, rather than take 10 years between films the way that Stanley and David Lean tended to do. I think that was very much a thing of the past.
I think Stanley would have approved of Brian directing it, and I would like to think he'd also approve of me writing it, but I'm quite sure if there's an afterlife. The first thing Stanley's going to say to Brian and myself is, gee, didn't I teach you, didn't you guys learn anything from me? You know, the compliments with Stanley, I tell you, used to flow like super glue, you know.
He would love the fact that Tony and I went out there and had a bit of fun with it, and I think he would enjoy it. I think he would think it was pretty good. He'd think we shot it quickly. And I'm sure he'd have plenty of criticism, but I mean, it's an interesting, unusual film, I think, and that's what first interested me in it, and I think it's what first interested Michael Fitzgerald, and certainly John Markovich.